Well, we haven't finished with disillusionment just yet. There's more disillusionment to come. So my talk today is the freeing and freedom of the Russian peasants. So on April 4th, 1863, a peasant trying to catch a glimpse of Tsar Alexander II as the Tsar strolled through the summer gardens in St. Petersburg reportedly saw a man near him, pistol in hand, raise his arm to fire at the so-called Tsar Liberator. Reacting quickly, the peasant bumped the arm of the would-be assassin. The pistol went off, but the bullet missed the Tsar. When the gunman was apprehended, he claimed to be a peasant, but further investigation revealed that he was a young radical of noble birth, Dmitry Karakozov. Immediately after firing the shot, Karakozov was dragged before the Tsar, who asked Karakozov why he had tried to shoot him. The gunman responded, "Look at the freedom you gave the peasants." For the next few minutes, we'll do precisely that. We'll look at the freedom that Alexander II gave 22 million Russian serfs. And as we evaluate the historical circumstances of emancipation in Russia, we'll gain some insights into the enormity of the accomplishment while also understanding why the Emancipation Acts tended to leave Russians of all social strata dissatisfied. So it's important to note that serfdom had developed into an institution that was indistinguishable from slavery in Russia. And to just kind of briefly go over the history of abolitionism in Russia, very briefly, it came under fire by some philosophers in the 18th century who were influenced by Enlightenment philosophers. Empress Catherine II had toyed with the idea of trying to abolish it, but she knew that her own claims to the throne were precarious, and so she relied on the landowning gentry for support. So to abolish serfdom would have put the throne in jeopardy. In 1803, Alexander I passed the law of free agriculturists, which allowed and set conditions for landowners to voluntarily free their serfs. About 1% of serfs were freed in the approximately 50-year period that the law was in effect. In his monumental study of a comparative study of U.S. slavery and Russian serfdom, Peter Kolchin writes that by the 1820s there really was almost no public defense of serfdom, and so by the middle of the 19th century, everybody from noblemen to serfs was starting to anticipate its demise and its abolition. Some of the motivation for abolition might have been the lack of economic viability, but other historians emphasize the moral considerations and also fear of peasant uprisings as motivations for emancipation. If we look at what the educated public was saying about slavery, whether these were people from the clergy representing the church or secular individuals, there were moral condemnations of serfdom as sinful. And in all of the rhetoric about serfdom and its abolition, there's a whole religious vocabulary and terminology. It's all cast in sacred terms. As a sacred act, emancipation would be a sacred salvific act associated with resurrection. And a lot of the educated public understood that sacralization metaphorically, but peasants sometimes took it much more literally, and so serfdom was associated with the kingdom of Antichrist and emancipation with the kingdom of the true Christ. The intent to emancipate the serfs was announced and discussed in the press from the 1850s on, late 1850s on. So by the time that the Emancipation Acts were decreed on February 19th, 1861, expectations were very high, and everybody kind of felt like society was on the verge of a profound transformation. The Emancipation Statutes of February 1861 directly impacted the lives of about 52 million peasants, about 22 million of whom were privately held serfs. So we're talking about a vastly greater number of people, although I should point out that Peter Kolchin notes that the proportion, slaves as a proportion of the population, was roughly similar to in the United States. So in the United States, it's about 33%, and in Russia, about 39.2% of the population. The legislation was signed in February, but it was announced to the peasants on the first day of Lent. And so that might be significant too in terms of the religious connotations or interpretations. Now, the actual terms of the emancipation did not take effect until two years later, but even in this interim, from the time that the legislation was announced publicly, among the peasantry, there were groups who thought that they were being deceived by Tsarist officials and members of the nobility about the true terms of the emancipation. So the legislation called for a 2-year transition period, and then as of February 1863, the peasants would be in a state of temporary obligation. And what that temporary obligation meant is that they had to pay for land. They were not given land, and they had to make redemption payments, and the terms of the temporary obligation, the redemption payments, were to last for 49 years. So freedom for the peasant, as Daniel Field explains, it did not mean freedom from custom and from their peasant community, but it did mean freedom from obligations to the landlord, and the announcement of the redemption payments and the terms of emancipation came as a harsh disappointment. So even still in the 2-year waiting period, there was some unrest. In about 718 instances, troops were called in to deal with peasant disturbances. These disturbances rarely led to violence. Usually just the presence of troops was enough to kind of put an end to the disturbances. But in one of the rare but renowned instances of violence, over 100 peasants were massacred by soldiers in April 1861 in Bezna. Peasants in that region were convinced that people were lying to them about what the emancipation statutes said. Then also, when the peasants paid for the land, they had to pay pretty inflated prices, far in excess of what the land was worth, and the steep redemption payments further contributed to widespread peasant poverty. And as you might expect, the nobility played a role in crafting the emancipation, and so the emancipation statutes favored the nobility. They got the better end of the deal. So in terms of land ownership, just to give you sort of one statistic here, a desyatin is about 2.7 acres, and 30,000 noblemen ended up owning about 95 million desyatins of the best land, while more than 20 million peasants end up with 116 million desyatins of land. So the material terms of the emancipation favored the nobility, but it's necessary to say a few more things to qualify what the freedom of the peasants meant in post-emancipation Russia. The emancipation required a whole series of supporting reforms. And one of the most crucial of those reforms was a sweeping legal reform in 1864, which made Russian citizens, in theory, equal before the law. So there was a single law code that applied to all social classes. Despite this de jure equality, in Great Russia, peasants did not become free in the sense of becoming autonomous agents after emancipation. The post-emancipation settlement was based on the historic, centuries-old institution of the commune. And so peasant life was organized communally, although we should keep in mind that that had advantages as well as disadvantages. But peasants were tied to their communes, and they couldn't leave the communes to just pursue their own interests unless they had permission from the elders of the commune. And also the elders of the commune made decisions about how the land, which was owned by the commune, not by individual peasants, how it would be distributed, and periodically they would redistribute it, and they made decisions about what kinds of crops would be grown on the land. The communal organization of Russian agriculture, this is in Great Russia, because the situation in Ukraine was a little different, but it perpetuated inefficiency in subsistence level production. Since the land would distribute, or the commune would distribute the land among the peasant households, and they'd sort of divvy it up so everybody got some of the good land and everybody got some of the bad land, but that meant that your land was not contiguous, your plots weren't contiguous, it might be quite a ways apart. And then as the sons came of age and started their own households, the families would have to partition up their plots even further. There was no tradition of primogeniture, and so it was very inefficient, and also tended to guarantee that peasants were relatively equal, but pretty poor. And then periodically the commune would repartition the land to try to come up with a more equitable distribution. So there was poverty, but it was shared poverty. There was a considerable degree of economic equality. In Ukraine, there was a little different situation of land tenure that perpetuated both poverty and economic inequality among peasants, because their peasants did have private plots and there wasn't a commune or any other system for reallocating the size of the plots based on household size. So poor households tended to stay poor and rich households tended to remain rich, not only creating some economic inequality, but some level of class antagonism within the peasantry. The terms of the emancipation, the communal organization of post-emancipation society still tended to reinforce a very stark divide between the peasant masses and educated society in Russia. For decades, Western travelers and observers in Russia had noted and commented that Russia didn't have middle class, it didn't have independent institutions, and they commented on this widespread gulf between the peasantry and educated society. It was a constant source of frustration for the Russian intelligentsia, those who took a critical stance about the regime and about Russian institutions and who wanted to work for an improvement in social conditions. The peasantry saw the intelligentsia as outsiders, and so while there was dissatisfaction with emancipation at all levels of society, and while the peasant question was central to a burgeoning revolutionary movement in Russia, this general dissatisfaction did not translate into some kind of strong, coordinated program of action uniting peasants with educated society. So to wrap things up, to conclude our discussion of the freedom that Alexander II and a whole host of advisors, bureaucrats, and landowners gave the peasants, we note that emancipation did mean freedom from the arbitrary rule of landowners. Emancipated peasants were no longer property, or as called in Russian, souls, to be counted as the measure of landowners' wealth. They were citizens with legal rights within the context of an autocratic state, that is, but freedom did mean a considerable degree of non-interference by the government in peasants' lives. On the other hand, freedom did not mean freedom from the commune, freedom to be autonomous, independent agents, although the peasants weren't necessarily seeking such freedom. Freedom, probably more significantly, did not equate to free land or freedom from poverty. So the legacies of emancipation under the terms of the 1860s legislation were the continuation of subsistence-level agriculture, widespread poverty, land hunger, all of which were destabilizing factors in late imperial Russia, or as Kolchin states, new forms of dependency that provided the ex-bondsman with at best semi-freedom became the rule. Exploitation, poverty, and bitterness endured even as the freedmen struggled to take advantage of changed conditions. While the emancipation was accomplished mostly peacefully, violence was the exception and not the rule. Subsequent decades were fraught with disillusionment and new ways of revolutionary activity, much of which was directly concerned with the so-called peasant question, and of which Karakozov's assassination attempt was just one early example. So, in conclusion, the we have a paradox here that I guess won't surprise historians very much, which is that while the emancipation of the serfs is generally regarded as a very profound, significant social transformation, a watershed moment in history, in many respects it's less impressive than it may appear on the surface. It's another, it fundamentally altered the legal status of the Russian peasant, but it didn't transform peasants into autonomous agents. It didn't alter the highly stratified nature of Russian society, and it didn't revolutionize the means of production. So, but knowing a little bit about what freedom of the peasants did and did not mean is pretty integral to understanding the subsequent course of Russian history. Thank you.